My name is Mark Hill. I am the owner and minister of music for Uncle Bobbie's. I am excited to welcome all of you here for another in a very, what is becoming a long and really exciting set of author talks. Here at Uncle Bobbie's, we decided when we opened that we wanted to not just sell coffee and books, but really create space for community engagement, community education, and to not let the universities have all the good ideas and all the good minds and all the great books. So while they're occupying and gentrifying our neighborhoods, we're trying to take a little bit back and bring some of these brilliant minds into our neighborhoods and into our space, and this is the People's Sanctuary, so that we can have great conversations. And I've been waiting for this book for a very long time. Noura Erakat is a great friend and a brilliant colleague and scholar. And when she told me that she was going to write a book, or was publishing her book and it was coming out, she sent me a copy of it and I read it right away. And I got super geeked about what I read. And then when it came out, I read it again. And both times, I was certain that you wrote something that was special, something that was a major intervention in legal studies, Middle East studies, Palestine studies, etc. But I also saw how much of yourself you put in this text, and your work as an attorney, your work as an activist, your work as a scholar, your work as a wonderful human being is all in this text. And I hope you are as proud of it as we are of you. And I just want to say thank you for writing it, and thank you for sharing some time here at Uncle Bobbie's. Can we give Noura Erakat a round of applause? The book is called Justice for Some, Law and the Question of Palestine. So let's get started. People have been waiting to hear you, not me. Let me ask you just...
I was actually enjoying that because he read the book twice and told me none of his feedback. So I was like, go in, okay.
That's true. I didn't say much. I was like, received.
And now twice. I'm like...
My bad. I meant to send you that note.
Y'all don't want to hear more?
Oh, we're going to get to more of your awesomeness throughout the night. I guess the first question, though, that I ask authors when they come here is why this book, and why at this moment?
Sure, no, that's a great question. So I'll be honest, I am in the academy, and there's a lot, as Mark was discussing, there's a lot of expectations in the academy about what knowledge production looks like. So for those of us who are researchers and who study for the emancipatory purposes, suddenly you're in a place that wants to discipline you and tells you your value based on a completely different set of standards. And freedom is not one of them, right? It has nothing to do with that. And so this might not have been the first book I wrote had I not been in that setting. I actually was much more interested with the other book. There's a lot in my head. So it's small, but there's a lot going on, and I chase characters all the time. But there was a book that I was really interested in about the relationship between settler colonialism, anti-Blackness, and women, and what women are doing in different sites in order to protect their lands and their people. I couldn't write that as the first project. This project, however, has also been with me. It is born out of my resistance work. It is born out of, I think, what a lot of people in this room are doing, which is struggling in the trenches. I was an organizer with Students for Justice in Palestine, where we launched divestment in 2001, before PACB launched it in 2005 as a global movement. And I was so frustrated by all the work that we were doing and what it was not yielding that I had this crazy idea, and I said, oh, I got it. If I go to law school, then we'll just use the law and we'll just convince them what's illegal and what's wrong, and then we'll get free. And of course, being that 20-something-year-old person, I was arrogant enough to think that nobody had thought of this before. And if they did, I was going to do it better. So that's not what happened. I'm in law school. My first realization is that it's a place where people get rich really fast. In a span of 3 years, you know what I mean? You catapult socioeconomically. So I was like, wait a minute. I'm looking around like, where's the Thurgood Marshalls here? That's what this was supposed to look like. But more importantly, I graduate law school and I go to work for the US campaign, then called to end the Israeli occupation, now the US Campaign for Palestinian Rights. And I go to see BDS campaigns nationally, but also to sue Israeli officials. I was like, this is the whole purpose. I want to sue these guys in US courts. And within the first year, we got our opportunity. Moshe Ya'alon, who was responsible for the bombing of a UN compound in South Lebanon in 1996, as well as Avi Dichter, who was responsible for the razing of 5,000 homes in Gaza in 2005, were both in the United States at the same time. And I was part of the team that served them. And we filed lawsuits in the Southern District of New York and in the DC District Court. And the idea is that we were going to bring claims against them pursued under the Alien Tort Statute, also known as the Alien Tort Claims Act. I mean, y'all, let me just tell you, this was it. This was why I went to law school. This is what we were gonna do. It was my moment to vindicate all the haters that said this was crazy. And in less than a year, both federal courts dismissed the case on justiciability grounds, which means that they dismissed it on questions of either it's a political question or it's a Foreign Sovereign Immunities Act, but claims that prevent the court from even asking, looking at the merits. We never even got considered. They didn't even ask the questions, right? And so immediately as an attorney, my next project was, okay, well, I'm gonna start researching other jurisdictions where the court will be more favorable. Obviously the Southern District of New York and DC suck, and they're just really conservative. Surely this will fare differently if we go to different jurisdictions. And in that research, in the course of doing that research, I was like, hold up. They sued Chinese officials, Guatemalan officials, officials from Papua New Guinea. They've sued Filipino officials. They've sued Serbian officials. They sued everybody under this. They sued Paraguayan officials. Joel Filartiga, who brought this case on behalf of his son, just died 2 days ago. That opens up the possibility of doing this in US federal courts. And I was like, this isn't about non-justiciability. They dismissed these cases because it was Palestinians suing Israel. And so what that strategic litigation research ended up being was becoming my first academic article. As I isolated those variables and I was able to demonstrate bias. And that becomes my first academic article. And that's a long way of saying that it was a series of experiences like that as an attorney that kept leading me to these dead ends where we couldn't overcome the political realities that planted a question in my head. What is the relationship between international law and politics? And what does it tell us about the struggle for freedom for Palestinians? And that seed that has been born out of those many experiences culminated in this book.
Wow, so this is that brilliance I was talking about. You know? She's just heating up.
Literally too.
So, the air actually has been on since 2:30. This is, the work of freedom. Yep. You can't get too comfortable. So, the question of law. Can you talk a little bit more about the question of law? One of the things you do in the intro, and throughout the books, but in the intro in particular, is you begin to problematize for us what the law is. You started to talk about that with your law school journey, this idea that we just have to prove that this is illegal.
Right.
Can you go underneath that analysis and talk a little bit about what the law is and what international law is? Because one of the points you raised in the second chapter is also this point about sort of how the law functions, who has the power to enforce it, and what does it mean for someone in the global north versus someone in the global south to be in contravention of international law? So talk a little bit about what the international law is, what its origins are,
Yeah.
and what it means to even have that as the centerpiece of your struggle.
Okay, great. So there's a few questions in there. Let me try to break that down. First, by starting by giving you a definition of what international law is. International law, by definition, is a series of explicit rules, treaties that have been drawn up by explicit consent, with the consent of the parties, as well as tacit consent, things that are unwritten, known as customary law. Those bodies together then regulate the behavior of states with one another and the way that they treat people within their jurisdiction, okay? As a definition, that's international law, and it's primarily a state-based framework. Individuals and the idea of human rights begins to crystallize in the aftermath of the Second World War, and particularly the Jewish Holocaust, and then makes it clear that state-based claims are not going to be sufficient in order to protect individuals. And so that you have, now individuals are now recognized as rights-bearing agents in the aftermath of the Second World War, and those rights are continuing to crystallize. That's the overall, okay, as a definition. Now there's the debate. There are different schools of thought about what international law is. The positivists will tell you that the law is what it says, and that you need to interpret it and apply it. And it's a matter of, we just need to doctrinally pay attention to the language, the drafting history, and that's how you apply it. The other extreme are what I would call the apologists for power, or the realists, who say international law is a fiction. It is a fiction. There is no way to enforce it. It is just used as a tool for the strong to bludgeon the weak to achieve their political objectives under the veneer of some legality. Okay?
Can you give an example of that, just so?
Absolutely. So, for example, when the U.S. tells us that they're going to invade Afghanistan in order to protect women's human rights, I mean, that's the most blatant one, right? They're completely going to destroy the infrastructure, decimate generations, contaminate the water and the land, but they're going to save the women. Yes. And the queer folks, because the bombs, as they come down, will just do, oh wait, this way, right? I mean, there's a lot to be said about the cynicism in law, and I share it, obviously, very viscerally. But I think then we take for granted, and one of the nuances that I found in my own research is then, but that's not true, because the law is actually doing work on behalf of progressive causes as well. And we see that. We've seen how it's ended de jure, segregation as a legal matter here in the United States. We've seen how it's led to, women's suffrage here in the United States. We've seen how it's created, human rights, apartheid is what criminalizes racial domination and differentiation in order to delegitimize apartheid in South Africa. So the law does that too. So you can't be a realist and take for granted that it's doing this work. So one of the things that I find, and by the way, this was all a learning journey for me. Where this book started and where it ended was not what I planned. I had none of it planned. And we can talk about that when we go into the content.
We're going to get to your writing journey.
Okay. But suffice it to say this, that the way that I then make sense of it is to understand that the law is politics. The law is politics. And in order for it to be used on behalf of progressive causes, it must be used in a sophisticated service of a political movement. Meaning that I think like a movement lawyer. There's some lawyers who walk into a space and they say, well, this is what the law says, so this is what your strategy should be. This is what the law says, so this is what your horizon for freedom should be. It could be some equality out here, right? Then the movement lawyers who come into the room and sit with the activists and they're like, what do you want? What are your demands? Okay, now let's figure out what parts of the law can support the project you want to accomplish. And they will cater and shape the law in order to serve that progressive cause, but it has to be led by the political movement. So the analogy that I create is that think of the law like a sail. You need it to move, but it can't move without the wind. And the wind is the political movement. So put up the sail when the politics are going your way. Draw the sail when the politics are not in your favor, and create a new sail when at all possible. Just make it up in order to get to where you need to go.
So how do we not become anarchists? Forget. Well,
why not?
That's why Paul, you saw me pull the anarchy back. Because that's not actually what I'm asking. How, if at some point we say the law is what we make it,
Correct.
then the same push that comes from a fight for Palestinian rights can come from the political opposition who can also appeal to international.
They do.
So then at what point does the person who's trying to get into the fight say, screw it, the laws, there's no point. We can't have any faith or trust in the law itself.
I struggled with this very question. I still struggle with it. Because the other thing about the origins of the law, for those who are interested, international law basically begins as a set of laws in order to regulate the relationship between colonial powers at sea. How are they going to navigate the seas which belong to nobody yet? Right? So this is how geographers are also thinking through sovereignty, and Laura Benson and that nerd list. And so this begins as a way to regulate colonial empire, colonial holdings. It then also begins in the Americas. It begins as a way to justify the massacre of natives through a civilizational framework. They're just not. It's not that they're not civilized. So the law recognizes them as humans. And recognize that you cannot believe in Christ and God and still, deserve to live, but they still don't understand this law, and so they're going to use it to bludgeon them or to justify their massacre. So you got to grapple with that. Like, this whole thing is nasty, right? But then why still do it? Because it's inescapable. It's like any other political reality that regulates our life, like the economy, like the disparity in military might, like the political status quo. Like, unless there is a revolution and everybody is in arms, then I'm not the one to tell people, well, don't use the law because it's part of the problem. We are the problem. Everything that we do is a living contradiction. Why would I lead people to that dead end? But use it cynically, use it wisely. Use it with a lot of faith and foresight.
Take me to a couple of moments in the struggle for Palestinian freedom. I want to pick a couple of moments where I think in the book you talk about the way the law is used or not used, because I think they're critical moments. The first moment is 19. Let's start with 1916. Let's start with 16. Let's start with Sykes-Picot and then go to 19. So 1916 is the Sykes-Picot Agreement. 1917 is the Balfour Declaration. When the Balfour Declaration is, you can walk the people through it. So, no, it's your book. But the Balfour Declaration becomes a moment, right, where the establishment of a Jewish homeland, very short declaration, only 67 words, right, but it becomes this very big legal document of sorts, right, as a way of establishing or asserting the right to a Jewish homeland. Not a Jewish state, but a Jewish homeland. National home, thank you, that's the actual one, the national home.
No homeland, there was never a homeland as part of the prospect.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So from there to 1922, where you talk about the Paris, Paris, right. That moment is a really interesting mix that you get at in the book about the way that the law is invoked at times when it's to the benefit of the project, and at moments where the international community is saying, hey, wait a minute, this ain't gonna work, slow down. There's a very different response. Talk about that moment and why it's important to help us understand this idea of colonial erasure.
Can I break down your question into two questions?
You sure? See, this is why you're good. I like this.
No, really, because Mark is asking two questions. One is about, the way that we narrate the story as one as, a bulldozer that was premeditated, that basically set out to erase Palestinians, remove them from the get. It was a conspiracy to begin with, which is not true. This was messy, this was haphazard. So much of it was a colonial blunder and it was a British mistake that they didn't anticipate. So that's what 1922 and the conflicts are. And it complicates this idea that this was always gonna happen. It wasn't. And the other one is about the colonial erasures, which is a piece that then carries us throughout the entire book, this seminal moment in 1917. So let me start with that, okay, because this will be a theme. You all are familiar with a Zionist myth that says Israel, the Jews didn't take the land away from Palestinians. It was a land for a people without a land. That's a 1969 quote from Golda Meir,
Yes.
Israeli Prime Minister, okay? And most of us that hear it, you know, the first thing that we understand of it is there's this mythology that Palestinians weren't there. But that's not it. That is actually what goes back to this 1917 moment. Peoplehood is in international law. Doesn't refer to people in this room. It refers to a political community. And a political community, unlike a population, has the right to self-determination or to self-governance, okay? In 1917, this is the aftermath of the First World War, the British and the French are basically victors over the Ottomans and the Germans, and they have now these vanquished empires, and specifically the Ottoman Empire in the Middle East, and they have promised all of these Arabs in what was formerly under, you know, imperial control, Turkish imperial control or Ottoman control, they have promised them self-governance in Iraq, in Syria, in Transjordan, in Lebanon, in Egypt. They never intend on giving them that self-control. These people have to fight for it. They're also part of the fight. Palestine is distinct because there, the British are interested in Palestine because this is going to be a significant Mediterranean port. They want to build a pipeline from Haifa to Mosul.
Yep.
They want to be able to, they know that their time in Egypt and their presence in Egypt is short-lived, so that they're going to have to leave. They need a foothold in the Middle East in order to remain present. So there are all these colonial calculations of what Palestine is, right? And at the same time, they have also made a promise to European Jews that they will establish a Mecca, a cultural Mecca for Jews to have a connection to. And that is the Balfour Declaration when the British colonial secretary writes a letter to Lord Rothschild and basically says that you can have Palestine as a place to have a home. But they didn't say you can have a Jewish state. They never said you can have a Jewish state. They don't want Jews to have a state. They don't want Palestinians to have a state. They want this to remain under some sort of ambivalent control so that they can remain present in the Middle East, all right? And that they can continue to be present. Why is this related to the erasure of Palestinians? In order for them to build that national home in a place where the Arab population identifies as a political community and wants to govern themselves, they have to deny that that population is a political community. They have to say, you're Bedouins, you're like other Arabs, and they say that, right? But they also say that this is holy land, and it's significant to all religions, all of the monotheistic faiths. So it can't be under any single people's governance. So it has to be under no control. And instead, what they do is they recognize the Arabs there, about 1 million of them, the Palestinians. They recognize that they have civil and religious rights, but no political rights. And that's what they write in the Balfour Declaration, is that we will establish a Jewish national home so long as it doesn't prejudice the civil and religious rights of the current inhabitants. That's how
It's just crazy that like they're framed the current inhabitants if they're the minority.
Right.
And at this moment, 1917 is what? How many?
Almost 1 million. They're 90% of the population.
Yeah, no, I was thinking how many Jews were there? 100,000. Well, I guess 100,000, right? So it's just interesting that they're not even mentioned by name. It's like, you know, don't hurt the other people who were there. It's really like the extraordinary majority.
And that's very explicit. Everybody knows that they're there. And in fact, this is when, now this, so far, up until 1917, until 1919, this is all British policy. This is what the British do. They haven't convinced the rest of the colonial powers and imperial powers that this should be their policy. That happens in the drafting, that the Paris Peace Conference that begins in 1919 to basically divide up these vanquished territories between 1919 and 1922, that basically culminates in the mandate system, where the Palestine mandate is recognized. What does that mean? All of the vanquished empires are placed under the mandate system, which is overseen by the League of Nations. They are categorized in a civilizational framework, A, B, and C. A being the Ottoman territories that their independence is provisionally recognized. B and C were African territories that were never set to be self-governing. So already there's this internal racialization that has created Arabs as superior to their African counterparts. So there are these civilizational frameworks at play. In 1922, the Palestine Mandate is adopted, and the Balfour Declaration is adopted verbatim into the text as the preambular text, and how to govern this territory, right? Palestinians are written out. They're not even recognized, they're inhabitants. They're not even recognized as the natives, because the Zionists who are lobbying these powers insist that they not use the word indigenous or native because the Jewish people want to claim indigeneity. So they recognize that there are people there, these scattering people, but they don't recognize that there are a people in the sense of international law. And when, you know, during the course of the debates, I think it was Balfour who says again, Zionism, right, this political aspiration to establish a national home, be it right or wrong, is far more important and noble than the current whims of some 700,000 Arabs. They know how many there are. They're under extreme scrutiny. The British are calculating everything, right? And yet this marks their first colonial erasure. Palestinians no longer exist.
How Palestinian, because one of the grand narratives, of course, taking a step back, is that there was no, and Golda makes this argument in 69, there was no Palestinian state.
Correct.
And no Palestinian people.
There wasn't.
And so, you know, you're talking Jordan, you're talking Greater Syria, you're talking, you know.
Greater Syria, yeah.
Right, so the argument is not just that the Palestinians didn't exist, it's that if they did exist, it was just a kind of homogenous group of Arabs who don't necessarily need to be here. Go to Jordan, go to Transjordan, go to.
So now we're getting into the story of, like, a really significant story that informs our present.
Yes.
Which is the fact that right now we organize ourselves within political communities, within state-based frameworks. But this wasn't an inevitability. Our present is a reflection of a European model that we have emulated and tried to recreate. What Frantz Fanon tells us in 62, you know, if all we want is the state, we might as well let Europe stay.
Right.
It's their project, and they're gonna do it far better than we can ever, you know, ours will be a botched up version of the ugliness that they're creating, and he was right. We did this is pretty ugly what we've done. But at that time, so when people say, but there was never a Palestine, we don't need to deny that and say that there isn't. There wasn't. The Arabs wanted to govern themselves as part of a greater Arab peoples that was connected to Syria, that was connected to Lebanon, that was connected to Jordan. We wanted a different model of self-governance. That is what we fought for. And that was part of the constitutional experiment that the Syrians led, where they are trying to prove their eligibility for self-rule. They actually create, and I forget the exact date right now, but they actually create a constitution. They have members, they've elected members into Congress. The French then invade Syria and destroy it in May Saloon in one day and append it. So it was in this context that nationalism as a nation-state model begins to crystallize, not just for the Palestinians, but for everybody else. So to the extent that anyone's gonna say, well, Palestinians never existed and shouldn't exist because they didn't identify as Palestinians in 1915,
right.
Nobody else exists either.
Right,
because they didn't.
Right, but there still were there was an emergent nationalism. I mean,
emergent.
The newspaper. It's created in 1911.
Yeah, but that's also because that's how it was governed as part of, you know, Ottoman Empire.
Right.
Like there is this land, but the attachment is to land. The attachment, it's a local attachment.
Yeah.
It's to vicinities. It's to Greater Jerusalem. It's to Greater Gaza. It's to, you know, it's to the Galilee. It's like there is an attachment to the land, but the framework, the nationalist framework that we are Palestinian is what crystallizes. But it crystallizes for everyone.
Right. It's not particular to them. Let's pivot a little bit to resistance in the relationship between international law and resistance.
Sure.
I want to talk about it both during the mandatory period, and I want to talk about it now, because in the book you do both. You take us to all the kind of rebellions. I'm really glad we didn't talk about this before. I mean,
My fault.
No. I'm just telling you how much I love the book, and I'm mad that I didn't tell you before. That's what I mean. you take us through the rebellions, 1920, 1921, 1929, the Great Revolt, 36 to 39. You take us through all these periods, and you talk about the emergent white paper that comes in 1930. So the Arab Revolt, from April of 36 to October of 36, there's this general strike in Palestine, and then from there you begin to see the other forms of resistance until 1939. Then this white paper comes out, which becomes the next major piece of legislation after the Balfour Declaration, which is saying, wait, we need to hold off.
There's one before that, but yeah.
Yeah, you're right, not the last major one. It's the one that prompted some of the sort of pre-World War II challenges, you're right, thank you. You present this, and then you talk about how the British in particular, as well as the Zionists, respond to Arab resistance, right? Because at first in the book you paint it as a kind of moment of triumph, right? They resisted, and then you get this white paper of 1939 that says we need to halt immigration, we need to reimagine this land transfer thing, we need to think about partition. You know, the Peel Commission comes out the report comes out the next year in 37. The report, right? So, but then it doesn't work out the way we expect it to.
No.
And then if you could juxtapose that to now, where we think about Palestinian resistance and what international law says about it, is there a consistent thread about how colonial power and state power more broadly responds to Palestinian resistance with regard to the law?
I see what you mean. So you're provoking me to say something that is really central, which is the fact that this book is about Palestinian freedom struggle. Okay? Like, there is no pretense. Anybody who wants to come at me and say, she's biased, like, damn straight. You know what I mean? Like, this is not a conflict, y'all. There is no conflict up in here. There is a significant disparity in power. The Zionist movement was aligned first with British Empire. It is now aligned with US Empire. It has been a significant military power. There is under no pretense that this is a conflict between two parties who need to break bread and get along. Okay? This is a Palestinian freedom struggle. And one of the things that I emphasize and try to do is to highlight our resistance. We have been fighting forever. Forever. Today is the 66th week, today, of the Gaza March of Return. In Gaza, 66 weeks of Palestinians who are living in the most dire situations, right? Under siege since 2006, under systematic war. We know 3 major wars, but there's been 22 between 2004 and 2014 of aerial bombardment, of living at the edge of humanitarian crisis. And people keep wanting to talk about, where's your Gandhis? Damn it, they've been there for 66 weeks.
Right.
They've been there, you know, why? Or last year during the embassy move, US embassy move from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, a bunch of people wanted to ask, oh, those Palestinians are just mad at Trump because now they're out protesting. No, then you haven't been paying attention. They've been protesting for 100 years. That's what we've been doing. We've been fighting and struggling for freedom. And that's one of the things I really wanted to lift up. So I actually begin my first chapter in the revolt. Because we know, oftentimes we think of the first Intifada in 1987, which means uprising in Arabic, and then the second Intifada in 2001, when Ariel Sharon walks onto the Temple Mount. But the first Intifada is actually in 1936, during this great revolt. So what Palestinians had done, they are now denied their peoplehood under international law. And everything they do, they're brilliant. Everything they do to use legal arguments in order to overcome their erasure are basically overcome with what I call the sovereign exception, right? So they say to the British, look, the Palestine mandate is null and void. Because if you look at the League of Nations Charter, it says that if you make a commitment that is in contravention to the local will of the people, then the will of the people overcomes that commitment. So the Balfour Declaration is null and void. And the British basically say, yes, but now that we've made this commitment needs to override, there's a special purpose, and they call, this is shorthand for telling you, they refer to the Palestine mandate as exceptional. They refer to it, something known in law as sui generis, which means unlike anything else. Sui generis in law refers to something that has no legal precedent that you can apply or analogy that you can compare it to. It is of its own, and it is what powers use when they say it's a sui generis situation. You basically, my argument, my theoretical contribution is that this is what allows these powers to create new law in order to fulfill their colonial ambitions. And they call the mandate sui generis. And Israel now calls the occupied territories sui generis. And they call Gaza sui generis. This argument is contemporary. And it's one that, it's the thread, and it's all predicated on this colonial erasure. So Palestinians can't overcome this legal argument. And finally, and by the way, within Palestinian society, there's an Arab form of governance, and then there's the grassroots. And the Arab elite want to continue to play a game with the colonial powers in order to prove themselves eligible for self-governance. This should sound familiar to the present. And it's the grassroots and young people. And a young man named Noura Erakat, who is a journalist, who was like, they need to stop doing this. They need to be as resistant as Gandhi is for the Indians. Now I know people have critique of Gandhi, but I'm just saying, insofar as he was anti-colonial, they were drawing on that. And so they launch a boycott. A boycott of the British. That becomes a tax boycott, that then becomes an all-out armed revolt. And it is so successful. It is so successful that they take over Jerusalem for 8 hours from British Empire, which now has to deploy 25,000 troops into Palestine in order to suppress the revolt and the uprising. And by the end, and then they're also recruiting Jewish militia to support them, which is how also Jewish Zionists are being trained in British colonial powers. And significantly, and this is really significant, they apply something that they've been applying throughout their empire in Malay, in Jamaica, in India, which is known as emergency powers, to basically say that they must suspend civilian law and apply martial law. I'm going to tell you why that's super significant in 3 seconds, more, but let me say this. Using that, they apply an unprecedented amount of force. 25,000 British servicemen squash the rebellion, end up either exiling, imprisoning, or murdering 10% of the Palestinian male population by 1939. So by 1948, Palestinians don't have the capacity to resist and overcome Zionist militias, which is part of the story. What about this emergency law is significant? And I'm going to get back to answering the white paper. I know I'm long-winded. I promise I'm going to get to this. But the emergency law is significant because in Israel's first act of government, they actually adopt the entirety of the emergency laws, and they apply it just to the Palestinians who remain, who didn't flee. And then in '67, they apply it to the territories. And today it still applies. This colonial reality is our present reality. Talking about the present. In terms of this question about the white paper, my argument is that Palestinians were not able to change the reality on the ground until they took up arms. Until they changed the situation, the political balance of power, and the military balance of power. The Peel report basically suggested partitioning Palestine into an Arab and a Jewish state, and Palestinians were like, why split the baby? We're still the majority, why would you do this? And the revolt is in response to the Peel report. And the white paper that comes in '39 says, okay, we were wrong, no partition, no unfettered Jewish immigration, we're gonna cap that, we're gonna cap land sales to Jewish immigrants. Instead, we're gonna let you come to a referendum and decide on having a Palestinian state, and then World War II happens. And in the aftermath of World War II, the entirety of the question of Palestine is transformed into the question of Jewish refugees, which then shifts our situation.
That's just, yeah. 2 more questions, and then I want to kind of open it up and then come back to you a little bit. And I want you to read a little something, which I opened up for you.
Is that what you want me to read?
Yup. Whatever it is, you just gotta read it. I mean, it's your book. You ain't coming up crazy.
I want to read from the end.
It's not the Balfour Declaration.
I want to read from the end. Okay. Oh.
So, what was my, occupation. I think it's a key point. Again, it cuts through the book, but also I think it's, many people here, even if they don't understand the nuance, they do understand this idea of occupation. From a legal framework, how can we make sense of the occupation? I mean, and again, I'm beginning from a place saying it's all occupation, but I mean specifically the occupation of the West Bank and Gaza from the 1967 war until now. Okay. Can you talk a little? You don't want to know?
This is my favorite question. What are you talking about?
Oh, okay.
I'm getting giddy. The nerd in me is like.
She is literally the biggest nerd I've ever met in my life. She gets excited over footnotes. Yes, it's really weird. So talk to me about this idea of occupation, and again, maybe even the selective invocation of the law, both by colonial power and others,
sure.
in making sense of it.
Can I just say something about footnotes?
Go ahead.
Can I just say something about footnotes, though? Yes. One of the hardest things, you know how hard it is to write about Palestine after 100 years? You know how many people have written about this? You know how many people think they're experts on this? And to all of a sudden come up and be like, I'm gonna write another book on Palestine. Like, what else are you gonna say on the thing everybody thinks they know and have written about and it's like been done? Well, I'll tell you what made it interesting for me. Most of what's been written about this, certainly, like in all of the academy, but certainly in the legal academy, has been written from an Israeli perspective. All of it. All of our knowledge production. You know, when we think about when knowledge is power, that's not like a cool slogan. You know what I mean? That's real. If you can't write your damn history, somebody else told you who you are and who you're not, and what you can become. So the thing for me about footnotes, Professor, is that part of my work was to unearth a Palestinian archive, which didn't exist, which hasn't existed. I mean, obviously it exists. I'm not the only one to do this, and I learned this from Dr. Shirin Ali, who, like in her book, Men of Capital, starts the book by saying we need to write a history of Palestine outside of the shadows of Zionism. But that means we have to know who are our people. And frankly, there isn't a lot. So a lot of my work had to be actually go to the region and chase living people down and document their stories and put down the oral histories and say, this is my source. And I've recorded it during their lifetime. That's what these footnotes are. And so I want to, you know, and that's the work that I think, you know.
No, that's major. That's major.
Thank you. But that's, you know, that's what Saeed, you know, has implored us all to do, which is to say, you know, there is a Palestinian archive still to be unearthed, and I'm just part of this. Filmmakers, artists are all part of that, creating new archives. Movements are that archive. We've created a new archive on delegations. Anyway, but occupation. So, okay, I don't know how much folks know and don't know. But on the cover of the book, if you get the book, you should, there are many different lines. They're not the 1967 lines. They're also the 1947 lines that propose partition, right? There are many lines that are written. What we have come to know on the question of Palestine in the present is what the 1967 lines told us, which is what Israel didn't occupy in 1948 or come to have jurisdiction over, and what they come to occupy in the aftermath of the 1967 war, which is not just the West Bank and Gaza, but the Golan Heights and the Sinai Peninsula of Egypt, okay? Israel wanted these territories. That was their ambition. What they got in the aftermath of the 1948 war was more than what partition gave them in 47 and what UN Resolution 181 gave them, which was only 55% of the land. They came to acquire 78%. But they wanted all of it, and even more than this, right? And in 1967, in the course of 6 days, they become an empire. They become an empire with all these holdings. And the way that it's negotiated immediately in the UN Security Council is that you must give these lands back to their rightful owners. And so there's an entire debate at the Security Council between June and November 1967 about how to give these lands back. And the third world is saying give it all back without preconditions. You can't steal something and then tell people that, you know, what they need to do to get it back. But
Why?
why not? Oh, why, really?
I know why, but there's a legal precedent about
yes.
conquest in the post-world.
Yes. The first two
I interrupt your
articles.
flow, it just seemed like an important intervention to me.
I thought you were being sarcastic.
Nah, why don't you explain to people
First
how
two
legal framework changed
articles. First two articles. So all of our history is a history of conquest. That begins to come into illegality and illegitimacy as nation states are now, you know, as sovereignty is acquiring new meaning. And by 1945, as the UN Charter is being drafted, the first two articles of the UN Charter have basically made the territorial acquisition by force absolutely illegal. You can't take territory, and you can't violate a nation's integrity, okay? In 1960, national liberation movements the world over successfully passed a UN declaration that basically declares colonialism as an illegitimate system of governance and justifies the use of force in order to append it, okay? In 1962, Algeria ends French settler colonialism and moves the French and have breathed new life into this anti-colonial movement. When Israel says now it wants to take these territories by force, there was absolutely no global context where they can get away with it. That was just not the global context. So they can't take the land. So that's what the negotiations were over. Even their primary allies, the US and the British, say you cannot take the land. But the debate between the US, the British, and the rest of the world is this. This is what it is. The US wants Israel to be able to retain the land as barter. They'll keep it and they'll give it back when when Syria, Egypt, and Jordan enter into permanent peace with Israel. That was the negotiation. The other option was you started the 67 war illegitimately, not in self-defense, you have to give it back. And the negotiations, I mean, you gotta read the book to figure out how that goes. But how the content of those negotiations and what
you
it
can't do that with a history book, right? Like we can find out how it is.
You already know the answer, but this is why it's relevant to the law. This is why it's relevant to the law. The final text of the Security Council Resolution 242 basically recognizes the US argument. Okay? The Israelis prevail. But the Israelis think it's not enough. They have no intention of giving it back, even if there's permanent peace. There's no intention of giving it back. So then here's why occupation, why I nerd out about this. Because so much of what we try to do is to say, there is occupation, this is occupation law, Israel has to leave. But Israel has created a sui generis framework that basically says, one, that the Palestinians are not a people, so there is no rightful sovereign to give the land back to. There's Palestinians don't exist, so we don't have to give it back. Occupation doesn't apply as a matter of law. Number two, the Security Council resolution, the final text of it, doesn't include a definite article preceding occupied territories. It says Israel must withdraw from occupied territories. And Israel throws its hands up and says, you didn't say which ones. And the third one is that now they are allied with empire. After the 67 war, the US realizes, which is hot in its Vietnam, war, it realizes, they had a stalemate policy to pivot, to basically place the Arabs against Israel to maintain a peace without peace, right? A non-peaceful status quo. But when they realized that Israel can do this work on its own as a military power, they realized this is its Cold War asset. And the US now establishes a new policy of inaugurating Israel's qualitative military edge, which is providing military aid to Israel under the Lyndon B. Johnson administration, enough military aid, weapons, support, logistics, intelligence to be able to defeat singularly any Arab country or collectively all of them if they decide to attack. So those three pieces together are precisely why Israel now actually is able to take the land incrementally because of occupation law, not despite of it. Without this framework, they would have had to leave.
That's great. I have one question, but I wanted to go to the audience. Let me just say something really quick, which is, so notice the footnotes in this book are extraordinary, and they're rich, and they're deep, and they take you into the nuances of the argument. But I also want you all to know that this book is extraordinarily well written, and it's well narrated, and each chapter gives you a thick, rich account of these historical moments. So if you're entering the conversation about Palestine right now, you don't feel like you're going to get lost, because she walks you through these steps. She walks you through the Balfour Declaration. She walks you through the 1967 war. She walks you through all of these moments with rich historical context. You're like a closet historian too. And then she gets into some of the weeds and the nerdiness of policy and law. And so I think this book has a lot of context, a lot of richness for everybody. So I don't want people to feel like this book ain't for them. It's really a special book. And you have a rare gift of being able to weave those two things together in ways that make this text both academic, but also accessible to a broader public. And it's a real gift you have. Questions from the audience?
Everything you've been saying, just like my mind is buzzing. But I think what I wanted to ask, and we were kind of talking about this before, is something that also feels really hard is the historic erasure, not just of Palestinian resistance, but what you kind of speak to is how it was coalitional, collaborative resistance of oppressed peoples all over the world that changed the horizon, the legal possibilities, right? That sort of like forced themselves into existence, also as Fanon writes about. And so I'd love to hear from your perspective, from your historic analysis, what were flashpoints from the global south? Because we think, only the US exists, right? Flashpoints of the global south that also changed or affected the legal framework and Palestinian resistance.
Yeah, that's a good question. Thanks, Anna.
Great question.
Can I also say that so much of what I write, yes, it's about Palestine, but it's really about the world and about other peoples. So this colonial erasure that I'm describing to you is not unique to Palestinians. It's actually the story of every indigenous people everywhere. They have all been erased in the same way that denies their political community. And we've done that in a series of Supreme Court decisions in the United States, and it's all done in the language of law. So this is an international story. This is a global story. But the question is about flashpoints. What are the flashpoints from the global south? The most significant ones is our revolutionary period. And it is a revolutionary period where in the aftermath of the First World War, the idea of self-determination begins to crystallize. But the way that the colonial powers are using the concept of self-determination in the early period is a way that justifies their presence and their ongoing penetration. So they say, we're gonna promise all these people independence as long as they look increasingly like us Europeans. This is Anthony Enke's work, okay? As long as they look like Europeans. But that means that we have to be in these territories in order to supervise them, to train them, and to monitor them. So self-determination in its earliest articulation is used as a justification for ongoing colonial domination. It's in the course of liberation movements that peoples take up arms and they basically say, no, that's not how this is gonna work out anymore. You're gonna leave and we're gonna force you out. And so this is when we have the height. This is the bubbling of what becomes our revolutionary period that begins, obviously, in 1960, when they passed that UN declaration condemning colonialism, there's only 55 states in the world. Today there's 194. So that's how many, Palestine is basically left out of this equation. They should have been the 195, right? Which is another story, but it's how do they have defined the horizon of self-determination as the first step to toppling white supremacy and to toppling imperialism. So self-determination of just becoming a state is not the horizon. It's actually the first step to creating a new world, or as Adom Getachew describes it, a project of world making. Okay? As they become increasing larger numbers within the United Nations, now they become a majority voting bloc. And they use that majority voting bloc to create new laws that are serving their causes, beginning with the 1960 Declaration that condemns colonialism. But I think one of the heights that I describe as a height, there's two heights that I describe. One is specific to Palestinians, one is for everybody else, the whole world. So for the whole world, it was in 1977, which is basically the two additional protocols, Additional Protocol 1 and 2 to the Geneva Convention. The Geneva Convention is what regulates war between states. Well, the additional protocols legitimated guerrilla combat and elevated the status of guerrillas to combatants and soldiers. So if you capture a guerrilla, they become a prisoner of war. A guerrilla has the right to shoot to kill, and it's not murder, right? A guerrilla has the right to engage in prisoner exchange and building tunnels in order to capture other soldiers, to exchange them, to use force, to target military, to have military targets. They basically legitimize this warfare and topple the framework of terrorism in 77. Clearly we're in a different period. Okay? That was for the world. But another high point for Palestinians is when they write themselves as a people into the law in 74. I'll let you read about that, okay? But let me tell you what they do once they are written into the law. They now join forces with the rest of the global South. There is a movement primarily to decolonize the African continent. This is the major flashpoint. It's the ongoing colonization of Africa, okay? And the Black Caribbean, but Africa is the flashpoint. And South Africa and Namibia are the biggest issues because the apartheid government is using international law to justify why it's still there. The South African government, the apartheid government, comes to govern South Africa as a mandatory power. The same way that the British was a mandatory power. They were supposed to usher them to govern, to something, but never leave because of a civilizational framework that Africans can never govern themselves. So it's the same, Namibians are fighting against the same thing. So there's a proposal there's a proposal to organize a decade against racism in order to delegitimize apartheid. And in 75, Palestinians with their allies go into the UN Third Committee and they decide to insert the word Zionism everywhere the word apartheid appears. And what culminates is General Assembly Resolution 3379 that condemns Zionism as a form of racism and racial discrimination. That was the high point. Palestinians rescind that in 1991 as a preconditioning to enter into the peace process.
We got one here, and then my brother right there.
How you doing? My name is Christopher Martin at Hampton University. And
Howard, Hampton University.
Oh, yeah.
It's near Howard.
But over the course of this past year, I first got introduced to Palestine and everything from actually Malcolm X symposium last year when they brought up Zionist logic. Malcolm X was telling a piece about Zionism and everything. And I kind of still feel like I'm new into the Palestine discussion. So oftentimes when I talk about it with other people, because I'm a political science major in my major, they often bring up Hamas and how Hamas is violent and dangerous and they're terrorists and all this other stuff. And it's hard to find reliable resources because, as you said, most of what is told is from Israeli perspective, imperial perspectives like the United States, Britain, and all those colonial powers. So my question to you is where do I find the resources to like navigate through that, and also how can I better understand the Palestinian struggle even through Hamas or any other organizations fighting for liberation?
Thank you. Thank you so much for that.
Good ass question.
I know, right? Yes, Billy. Let's freedom dream. So I'm gonna, two things, okay? The first is that, three things. Sorry, y'all. Number one, Hamas is a political party with a military wing, known as the Al-Qassam Brigades. But it's a political party, okay? And it came into governance through an election. So to even try to like say that all of Hamas is the same as Al-Qaeda, or the same as, you know, they're like Hezbollah in Lebanon. They are a political party that represents the Shiite minority in the South that comes into office in order to represent them. Hamas develops not to represent a minority, but is an offshoot of the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt that believes that the way to our liberation is through internal salvation. We have to become closer to the Word of God. And once we become right within ourselves, we can be right with the world. And they actually are pressured to be, they're an underground movement, right? And they become pressured to become a nationalist movement in 1987 in the context of the Intifada. So what they are today, right, is a political party with a military wing. And there's only about 15,000 militants of the 2 million person population in Gaza. So just in terms of numbers of what we're talking about. But the framework of Hamas, as you rightly pointed out, is a discourse unto itself that makes us collapse all of the Palestinians in Gaza to be synonymous with Hamas, and to synonymize Hamas with all of Palestine, right? So one resource I want to point you to is a film project that I worked on with a group called Gaza in Context. It comes in 20 minutes, and it basically, you know, basically it makes the argument that Israel doesn't have a Hamas problem, Israel has a Palestine problem, and it situates Israel's wars within a settler colonial framework. That what it's doing in Gaza today is not about national security, it is about elimination. This is racial elimination. This is native erasure. That's one and two. Number three, Malcolm X and Zionist logic in 1964 touches on a much deeper conversation that I actually had been having with my brother Mark out here about Black Palestinian solidarity. What it is and what it isn't, and how we understand it better. And so that's its own discussion. So let me just plant that seed. Maybe somebody else wants to ask another question. But I do want to say that historically, Black Palestinian solidarity wasn't articulated as Black Palestinian. It was articulated from here as a Black internationalist project that saw Cuba and China and Africa as the site of world making. And Palestine was part of that project. Now, in our contemporary moment, those sites of colonial domination are no longer as pressing and relevant. And Palestine has become central to the analytic of understanding this solidarity. And the way that I think about it is that Black Palestinian solidarity has been an anti-imperial analytic. One that understands the entwined nature between racism and colonialism, and understands that Black subjugation in the United States is part of a colonial project, and understands that, this is part of a thinking about Black people are a nation within a nation. Ghettos, maternity, like birth rates, access to health, food, education, poverty, all those metrics match up with a metric of colonial geographies. So therefore, that these two things are related. And so Black liberation is not complete within the framework of the United States, it's complete within an international framework. And so that's what's drawing those things together.
Can I get you to say just one more Hamas thing?
Of course.
Now let me to my brother's question here. But I'm thinking about him in particular, the young man who's saying he's in conversations and people bring the Hamas question up. One of the things that people bring up is the question of rockets. And I think, I've heard you talk a little bit about the complexity of the legal dimensions of what it means to say, well, but they're firing rockets and they're indiscriminate. And then also, obviously, the question of Israeli, there's a legal piece to this that I think is worth talking about.
Exactly what you're getting at. So one, let me just say that Israel has been occupying Gaza since 1956. That was the first occupation they were pushed out of. Then they occupied it again in 67. Hamas doesn't come into existence until 87. So anybody who wants to talk about Hamas, you gotta ask them, well, why was Israel in 56? Have them, turn the tables. That one. On the question of rockets, there is an international framework that regulates the use of force. Hamas has the right to use force. Within an international legal framework. Now, because they have that right to use force, it's also limited. They can only target military targets. They can target military infrastructure, they can target soldiers. They cannot target civilians. But they also can't use reckless force, which means that they can't control their use of force, that it's so reckless that it was bound to hurt civilians as well. All right? Now we're getting into the realm of illegal use of force. When colonial powers explain their reckless use of force, they call the civilian casualties collateral damage. When Hamas uses that reckless force, it's terrorism. My response to this is, one, in law, right, is that Hamas has the right to use force, but because its weapons, they're so crude, they do not have weapons technologies, that they can't determine the route of the rocket, that it's ipso facto reckless and illegal. Their use of force is not illegal, the use of rockets, these crude rockets are. But we should be less concerned about Hamas's use of force, and if that was really the concern, then we should be okay with other countries giving them advanced weapons. But that's never the conversation. The conversation is that no matter what they can target a bus of soldiers, and that's terrorism, right? So and then here, but that way, that gets it stuck. And that was the conundrum that the world community had in 1977 as well, which is once they were agreeing to this legal framework, they knew that they were now gonna be at a disadvantage against states with advanced weapons technologies that they can never militarily confront. The whole point of guerrilla combat is to be able to leverage the weakness of the more powerful adversary. So this doesn't answer the question, right? This doesn't answer the question of, so what do they do? I personally don't think that it's very helpful, but I also have been witness to 66 weeks of civilian protests that the world has ignored, where there's been massacres and everybody blamed Hamas anyway, even though they had nothing to do with the protests, where the Israeli Supreme Court has described the protest as Hamas's new weapon. So we're also in this reality of they just want us to surrender. That's really what's at issue. But I always think it's a good conversation to, it's illustrative, yeah?
All right, those were two awesome questions. Mine's pretty basic. I just really hope to understand, what was Palestine before the world wars, up to how it became actual Palestine, and how and why the Israelis argue that Palestinians never existed? I just don't understand.
So Palestine before the world wars was part of the Ottoman Empire, which stretched from Turkey to the southeast of Europe and all the way to, the Gulf, right? It stops at the Gulf. So this is the Ottoman Empire. So they're all under, but this is the whole world. The whole world is under imperial jurisdiction. But the locality was that it is described as Palestine, but the people there aren't described as Palestinians. It is described as Palestine. Yeah, this is like a biblical name. So we are referring to these lands in these ways. It's just whether or not the Palestinians were describing themselves as Palestinians or as Arabs or as Syrians and how they were identifying. Nationalism is a 20th century concept. It's crystallizing in this moment. Nobody had a nation state. People there's a sense of belonging. that continues, by the way, and I think is relevant. What was the second question? Oh, why do Israelis say Palestinians don't exist? They're settlers. And so, they're settlers. It's why we deny indigenous sovereignty. It's why we're here on, Lenape Nation, right? We don't exist under Lenape jurisdiction. We exist under, U.S. jurisdiction. We abide by the Constitution, not by native, governance and sovereignty. So they say they don't exist is because they're made up, they're Arabs, they're Bedouins. But that's the thing about all nations, and this is political theory, right? Benedict Anderson shows us this. All nations are imagined communities. So, who are you? We have determined who we are. Who gets to exist and who doesn't. Palestinians exist because we are claiming a common history, a common language, a common land, a territory, and a common future. That's why we're Palestinians. Not because, that's why Ghanaians are Ghanaians, right? That's why Jamaicans are Jamaican. Why are they not Bahamian? Why does the Dominican Republic, why does South Africa today, why is South Africa one of the most xenophobic countries on earth, basically deporting other Africans? Or the DR deporting Haitians? These are imagined communities. Now, which is the next question. Is that it? Is this it for us? And that's the work I'm trying to get at. I don't think that's it. I don't think that's it. My community is much bigger than that. My community is queer. My community is black. Community is indigenous. These are the futures I want to build, and this is my common future. But I also believe that because we're in a place of where we're being removed, our claim to belonging is at stake. That I will call myself a Palestinian. I am a Palestinian. I will fight for Palestine because I belong. And once that is no longer in controversy and under fire, I will now fight for a different community in a much bigger way.
Hi. I have a question. Hi. Thanks for taking your time to share all of your amazing thoughts with us. I have a question about movement lawyering, and specifically movement lawyering in the international legal context. How do you see that being effective? Like, how does that look like to you, if you have an idea about how we're going to work on this together, and what are lessons learned from third world solidarity work from 50 years prior?
I think that'll be the last question. Let's do one more question. Any more questions? No?
Oh, then I might read something from the end.
Yes, that's what I mean. Last question. You still get to read.
So let me just, I'm going to give you an example. We don't have a third world resistance movement right now. We have it in very informally. We have, pieces of that in the World Social Forum. We have pieces of that in our Black Palestinian solidarity. We are a social movement. We are no longer under the framework of a third world revolt. To the contrary, the frameworks that we were once the vanguard of our movement have become our primary oppressors, right? And that has been very, very vivid in the course of the Arab uprisings. That all of these once revolutionary figures have become our dictators, where they crush social movements to consolidate their power under this idea that we are only strong as one nation, and so and there was a negotiation that basically said, you will give up your political and economic rights in exchange for civil and social rights. And we've been under that kind of status quo. We really need to imagine new ways of organizing ourselves. So there isn't really a third world, I think, way of lawyering. But what about, how can we be creative? So let me give you an example. Everybody's excited that finally the Palestinians are going to sue Israel in the International Criminal Court. Get them. Right? Get them. Get those war criminals. I want to see Netanyahu on trial. Get him. I know, right? I'm setting you all up, by the way. Here's the problem. We're never gonna see Netanyahu on trial. We're never gonna see it. It's never gonna happen. And it's not because it's never gonna happen because we can't get him. And Omar al-Bashir, who has a warrant out for him in the Sudan, who is not nearly as powerful as Israel. There's like an uprising, he's been ousted from power, will not be on trial for his war crimes, right? There is a structure where the entire apparatus of the ICC has been put into question. So that's one. The ICC prosecutor is in a position where she's lose-lose. If she prosecutes Israel, she will basically lose favor and funding from Israel and the US, who are not signatories to the Rome Statute, but who will no longer fund it, and it will fall out the bottom. It will no longer be international. It'll be seen as a marginal tool. If she doesn't prosecute Israel in order to maintain that legitimacy, then the ICC is going to be seen as a charade by the entire world, because since its inception, they have only prosecuted African heads of state and Slobodan Milosevic. So it's a lose-lose situation, one. Two, there is the law. If you look at the granular pieces of the law, there is basically an article of complementarity that says that if a country can prosecute itself, then the ICC can't have jurisdiction. What that means is if that countries that are the most advanced and have developed their legal systems and have the capacity to prosecute themselves can't come under ICC's jurisdiction, which means that all the industrialized countries will never be prosecuted. So who gets prosecuted? Us. And in this situation, if this goes through, and I promise you this, Bensouda, the prosecutor, will prosecute Hamas militants first. Now, they're okay with that. Hamas is okay with that. That's why they signed on to it and approved for the PA to pursue this. I'm setting this all up to tell you, there is no way to win at the ICC. That's not where we're going to find justice. But where we can win, is using the case at the ICC to run a marathon, to basically win in popular court, to make our legal claims to audiences in the sanctuary, on the streets, where we have puppets, right, in the streets that basically say that Netanyahu is a war criminal, where we mobilize communities to delegitimize Netanyahu whether or not he actually get some warrant that says he's a war criminal. That as a movement lawyer, you have to win popularly, even in the face of systematic legal defeats. Because the law is for the powerful, that's what we know. So if we know we're gonna lose, then how do we leverage that loss into a win? And the Palestinian leadership never did it, and have no intention of doing it, and are not equipped and are not thinking, I think, radically enough to see that.
That's amazing.